Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our philosophical discussion. My name is O'Brien, and joining me is Givanya and Patricia, who you will be meeting shortly. Today, we will be discussing the prevalent topic within philosophy of science, that is the demarcation problem. What is the demarcation problem? Essentially, the demarcation problem is a question of how one would distinguish science from non-science. This would also include pseudosciences, or subjects that would present themselves as scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. Why is this relevant? Anything that would attempt to identify as science would therefore adopt qualities that are intrinsic to science. Science, simply put, is fact. Any field of knowledge masquerading as science would then establish itself as factual. This would diminish the quality of all true sciences as merely questionable rather than factual, and would raise pseudosciences and non-sciences to the degree of credibility that only real sciences have. So to begin with, let's attempt to define what science is. The word science was borrowed from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge, awareness, and understanding. It is a system that builds and organizes knowledge based on verifiable and empirical observation, also known as the scientific method. There are multiple types of sciences that study reality, such as that of the physical world, also known as natural sciences, or individuals and societies, or social sciences, among many others, arguably formal sciences and applied sciences. Everything else outside of this definition is therefore non-science or possibly pseudoscience. To make this more simple, let's set some examples. Our examples of science include geology, chemistry, biology. Non-sciences would be art, literature, music, theology, and pseudosciences could be astrology, magic, homeopathy. If you're familiar with the recent craze surrounding essential oils or stones, which emit a certain energy or wavelength claiming to solve any number of conditions, these are actually pseudosciences, protesting medicinal cure-alls that have no basis in verifiable empirical evidence and therefore are not sciences. These have not been tested and cannot be repeatably produced results through the scientific method.
Alright, so let's start with the old demarcationist tradition, specifically in the medieval era. Okay, before we jump into the demarcationist tradition, let us first know the basic of the demarcation, which is according to Aristotle. Awesome dude right there. So, to be scientific, one must deal with cause, use logical demonstration, identify the universals that inhere in particulars of sense, and mostly to have apodictic certainty. Aside from that, Aristotle also proposed several criterions that leads to demarcation, not explicitly, only leading. So the first one being is the first principles of nature should be directly intuited from the human senses. The 5 senses, not 6, not 7. And second one is to distinguish know how versus know why, which is actually a demonstrative understanding. Now, starting off with the 17th century, the dominant discussion is that science is distinguished from opinion and superstition by the certainty of its principles, and its mark off from the crafts by its comprehension of the first causes. As the criteria, the first one being demonstrative based on necessary first principles, or directly intuited from the human senses. The second criteria being free from opinions and superstition. The third criteria being marked by first causes comprehension. Now, let's look at 2 of the famous philosophers in the 17th century, starting with Galileo Galilei, which proposed science of motion that has results claimed as infallible and demonstrative. The second philosopher, Isaac Newton, also have famous findings, such as gravity, like apple falling from a tree falls to the ground, or optics, which is the discovery of multiple rays of white light, and the 3 laws of motion, or in Principia. Now that the 3 findings, as it is also mentioned by Newton himself, the theories are directly based on the observation without any hypothesis, which is infallible and it's certain. Now, the conclusion for the demarcation in the 17th century is that scientific knowledge is apodictically certain. Moving on to the 19th century, unlike what is concluded in the 17th century, philosophers in the 19th century claimed that science have no apodictic certainty. and that all scientific theories are corrigible and may be subject to serious emendation. Therefore, the difference between knowledge versus opinion is no longer valid to distinguish between science and other subjects. So there are several claims regarding the demarcation, starting with the fallibilism, which is science is a species of genus opinion. And the second claim, which is done by several philosophers of science, being scientific opinions were more probable or more reliable than non-science ones. And the second one is that infallibility or certainty is no longer the hallmark of scientific knowledge. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I reveal the first key of distinction between science versus pseudoscience and non-sciences, according to 19th century philosophers, is the methodology, called as the scientific method. Not necessarily 100% foolproof, yet it's a better technique to test empirical claims, and it's also sufficiently self-corrective to mistakes. So there are two indicators to science, according to the philosophers, which is the first being the unity of methods, or essentially the same repetition of methods. And the second one is the establishment of the epistemic credentials of the method. Okay, so now the question is, what is the scientific method? So before we jump right into that, comment down below on what do you think about the scientific method. And let's see whether your answers is right or wrong. Okay, some insist that the theories in methodology must be restricted to observable entities, but it is actually rejected with some, and instead the theories should include decisive methodological tests that could make surprising predictions. Furthermore, it is clarified by Pierre Duhem in 1908 that the mighty scientific method have small amount of resemblance to the usual methods used by current working scientists in the era. So, the answer to the previous question is none. There's no specific scientific method that is well agreed as the most effective to distinguish science and other subjects. And there is no proposed scientific method as qualified candidate to knowledge or even is superior to the other fields besides science. With this, however, scientists and philosophers of science continue to search and prove that scientific method remains a strong demarcation for science, and it eventually results in what is known as scientism. That was a pretty successful era in progress, yet with full results in the end. Now, as elaborated, it can be seen that the attempts and efforts to achieve the scientific method as the main demarcation criterion lies several considerations in the science itself, which further prove that science is not the perfect answer to every question in the universe. Starting with the first being the elements. According to plato.stanford.edu, some demarcation referring proposals are applicable, yet the assessments of the application, on the other hand, can be either interdefinable or ambiguous, especially with pseudosciences. Meaning, by using the demarcation criterion as assessment, it is possible to infer that pseudoscience fields have scientific essences. Comment down below on what are the subjects in pseudoscience, or even non-sciences that actually meets the indicators proposed in demarcation. So, the second one being is the limited time bound. It was then further observed as well that science, pseudoscience, and non-sciences has certain time bound, which then makes the demarcation not timeless, unlike what is maintained or proposed. So, the conclusion for the 19th century demarcation is that none of the indicators in either certainty or generation in the methodological rules was appropriate and adequate to set science really apart from the other subjects. So what do you think about the old demarcation? Feel free to drop your opinions in the comments down below. However, scientists and philosophers of science still strive to figure out the real demarcation that can denominate science, which we'll further explain with my colleague, Givanya.
Hello everyone, my name is Givanya, and now I'm going to continue the discussion of the demarcation problem. In relation to the demarcation problem, I'm going to discuss about verificationism and the falsification theory. So Karl Popper was an Austrian scientist that's specifically interested in the demarcation problem. He even claims that the demarcation problem is the center of the philosophy of science. Throughout his studies, Popper notices how different scientists have different approach in science. So in the past, some Greek scientists obtained knowledge and science discoveries through empirical studies, in which knowledge is obtained solely through our senses, suggesting that theories involving scientific discoveries can be verified. In other words, this theory is called verificationism. What this means is we simply look at what we see, then develop a hypothesis based on that certain observation, and think everything correlating to the idea is verified. What it means is when we begin to test a theory, we are confirming it. For instance, we believe that there's no way human can travel through time. We're aware a lot of people have done studies around this, and no one has succeeded, therefore time travel doesn't exist. So here where the problem lies in the verification theory. He believed this method can only serve theories that can prove anything, to simply verify every theory. Thus, he rejects strongly of this view of verificationism. The reason why we can't verify scientific theories is that there's always a possibility of something can happen in the future. We can't confirm something without considering the possibility. Thus, Popper believed that it's illogically impossible to verify a scientific theory of law of nature. Instead, he believed the falsification theory, where science is falsifiable through observations that have the capability to be proven false. When we begin to test our hypothesis, it is wise for us to falsify them instead of verifying them. In theory of time traveling, we can only prove its non-existence by discovering or showing that it's simply impossible. Thus, we can conclude that a scientific experiment or any form of investigation, it's a method of falsifying them. So when the data or scientific research is false, we can replace the research with a new theory. The purpose of falsifying is to find closer truth regarding scientific research. Then we can assume that non-science doesn't make falsifiable statements, which means verification is a form of non-science and pseudo-science. But there's a disadvantage. The disadvantage of falsification theory is that it indirectly supports pseudoscience as a science. In an example of astrology, we're aware that it's fictional since it consists of mythical beliefs of horoscopes, but mimics the quality of science. We can easily falsify statements within astrology and claim them to be false. For instance, Libra is known to be indecisive. Through this statement, we can falsify them and simply revise the theory. Okay, now my question for all you viewers are: first, what is verificationism? Second, what is falsification theory? And third, what are the disadvantages of falsification theory? So comment down below to answer these questions.
So in conclusion, is the demarcation problem actually a pseudo problem? According to Larry Lawton, it is. The demarcation between science and non-science was a pseudo problem that would best be replaced by focusing on the distinction between reliable and unreliable knowledge without bothering to ask whether that knowledge is scientific or not. Essentially, the categorization of different bodies of knowledge is arbitrary. This is especially relevant with the reemergence of interdisciplinary sciences, where one body of knowledge joined with another body of knowledge, where one could be science and one could be technically not science, is the thing as a whole of science. According to Lawton, to call one thing a science and another thing a pseudoscience is not a statement of fact, but merely emotive. Suitable for those who want to push a narrative or agenda, such as politicians and sociologists, according to Lawton. What is significant is whether that body of knowledge is factual and not if it's labeled as scientific. Philosopher Herbert Kuth refuted this by saying that, quote, perhaps the most important function of the demarcation between science and non-science is to refuse political and religious authorities the right to pass binding judgment on the truth of certain statements of fact. And this is most relevant today because of the rise of fake news. So what do you guys think? Is the demarcation problem relevant? What's your definition of science, non-science, or pseudoscience? And possibly can you give some examples? Or what are some bodies of knowledge that are still questionable, whether they fall into either of those categories? Thank you for joining us, and this is it from us.